Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you, and a very warm welcome to this book launch of the Oxford Handbook of Peaceful Change in International Relations. My name is Pascal Venesson. I am a senior fellow and professor of political science at RSIS, and it gives me great pleasure to be the chair of our webinar and the chair of this book launch today. Before we get started, and as you know, we have just a fantastic panel for you this morning, I'd like to highlight the fact that this book launch seminar that we are having is part of a collaboration between RSIS and the Global Research Network on Peaceful Change, GRANPEC. GRANPEC is a worldwide research network comprising scholars and institutions engaged in the study of peaceful change at the international and regional levels. And our speakers in today's webinar are members of this network, and Professor T.V. Paul is the founding director of this network. Let me tell you a word about how we are going to proceed today. We will go in the order of the program. Each of our presenters will have about 10 minutes, 12 minutes to summarize key aspects and key contributions that they made to this handbook, to this Oxford handbook. At the end of all these presentations, we will, of course, open the floor for questions. You will have an opportunity to use the sort of magic Q&R little box and to ask any question you may have on this, and I will relay your question to our speakers. I am sure that at this point, some of you are saying, will there be an opportunity to buy this fantastic Oxford handbook with a discount? Now, the answer is yes, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, this opportunity will be there. And in fact, we will show you the magic QR code roughly midway through, right at midpoint during our webinar. We will show it to you then. And we will also show you this QR code towards the end of our session with the closing slides. Okay, so you have an opportunity to do this. It's like a once in a lifetime opportunity. It's a great bargain because you buy a sort of encyclopedia of extremely rich and thoughtful contribution to a major issue in IR. So no, I'm not getting any commission out of those books that we are selling. No, Professor T.V. Paul told me that's not the case. So, but please take this opportunity. It's a great contribution. All right. So without any further ado, once again, welcome to this book launch. And I'd like to give the floor to Professor T.V. Paul, a great friend in general and a great friend of RSIS. It's fantastic to have you back with us today, TV, for the first presentation. Please take it away.
Thank you, Pascal. And my very dear friends at RSIS, it's been a while since I have been to your allowed us to meet again, Zoom technology. One thing I must say that the handbook is about 840 pages or so, and very thick. And among the editors are 5 of us, and Ralf Emmers is one of the co-editors, along with Professor Deborah Larson, Harold Trinkunas, and Anders Wivel. I must also note that the largest contingent of individual contributors are actually from RSIS, people sitting on this panel, which is actually a testament to the fact that you are a very important part of our network, and also this project benefited tremendously by your participation. So what is this handbook? Why do we need it? Pascal alluded to the network that we inaugurated in Toronto, ISA, in 2019. And since then, we have been working on it. We wanted to hold a big gathering at Hawaii ISA that was cancelled. Despite that, within a short period, 2.5 years, we managed to assemble some 41 chapters. And I must say that our contributors were immensely supportive to this enterprise. And the realization that the existing scholarship in IR is yet to give its due share to the study of peaceful change. Of course, everybody talks about it. Peace is a big part of our discipline. We have all the isms in somehow or other. But peaceful change, as much it got attention during the interwar period, has not been given as much attention until a recent time, of course. And the Cold War happened without a conflict, a war. So that was a big moment. But now we are in a very pivotal moment, perhaps like the 1930s. And so we need to focus on this a lot more. That's what prompted us. And so I start off by a kind of an introductory chapter in the handbook, summarizes a lot of themes that will be addressed later, and also focusing on a couple of definitions of the phenomenon in international relations. We want to study it on a continuum and a minimalist understanding. Of course, meanings and concepts change, they are historically contingent. Change, minimalist approach, change in international relations and foreign policies of states, including territorial or sovereignty agreements that takes place without violence. So basically the point is absence of major violence is very critical to this understanding. It doesn't mean, I want to emphasize that many people make this as a normative project. In fact, there is some normative concern here. Not all peaceful change is for the good. Indeed, some may lead to violent outcomes, and we have evidence of that in our historical understanding. The handbook discusses some of them. The maximalist approach definition would refer to transformational change that takes place non-violently at the global, regional, interstate, and societal levels, leading to deep peace and higher levels of prosperity and justice for all. So that's sort of the continuum, but most often we are talking about in-between categories. Carl Deusch's approach about institutional recourse to problem solving instead of violence. And then we discuss a little bit systemic, regional, subsystemic, and changes. IR definitely privileges the systemic approach in the power transition mode, and Gilpin's notions about systemic change and system change, of course, regional change, all are covered in different format in our chapters. We discussed a little bit about the interwar period debate, the 1919 Paris Peace Conference in 1939, the big debate that took place. In fact, the foundations of the IR discipline, as everybody knows, go back to that period and this debate about peaceful change. But peaceful change got a very bad rap after the equation of it with appeasement, and then the rise of Nazi Germany. And so the enthusiasm that was in the 30s vanished. Then the Cold War, of course, transformed the system into a very much binary, a very much conflictual mode. And but I think the end of the Cold War, during the Cold War period also, the European states transformed. They had a lot of initiatives that were in the peaceful mode process. Then you had the non-aligned movement, and a lot of countries trying to navigate the Cold War. But the point is, the end of the Cold War, Gorbachev really gave us the idea of peaceful change in many ways that affected, that caused a systemic change. Now, then, of course, China's peaceful rise strategy, another major innovation in many ways that has generated a lot of interest. Then the onset of intensified globalization, rise of new institutions. Of course, these are all changing now. This is itself is a fascinating topic. Why do countries, especially great powers, after resorting to peaceful change strategies for a period, why do they abandon them? Are they because of nationalism, or they because of the imperatives of power politics? We discussed the isms in our perspectives, theoretical perspectives, realism, liberalism, constructivism, and alternative perspectives, and even some beyond paradigms. Steven Pinker has written a couple of interesting books. Incremental ideas are there. The sources of mechanisms, international law, technology, nuclear deterrence, climate change, democracy, social movements, etc. But the point is that these mechanisms are prone to change, especially if they are changing in different manifestations. We discussed the great powers and rising powers and their contributions. Often they are viewed as violent actors. Great powers in history, European great powers have been violent, but they have also contributed to peaceful change. And that's interesting to look at the US. Deborah Larson has a look. Even Monroe Doctrine may have caused some peaceful change, not necessarily what the sort of hegemony, but at the same time, it has prevented European powers fighting too much in the Americas. Debated question. Russia's contribution, amazing how Gorbachev came about, and why are they abandoning it? Is it about status? Is it about status lights? Is it about humiliation? If so, political psychology, we need to bring that in. Why is China, the Deng's China that everybody started loving, is now into this imperial mode? And whatever you say, it is unfortunate that China has to rush this up. China was bound to get there. And if it just slows down and not to threaten neighbors, as the European powers did, imperial powers did, among themselves in particular, perhaps we could get a new round of peaceful change. We discussed the pivotal states, Germany, Japan, India, Indonesia, South Africa. Of course, Germany is an interesting case, Japan also. And then regions, that's where I think some of your contributors have done really good chapters. European experience, ASEAN, Africa, South America, South Asia, where I think the big question is why that region has such trouble transforming into in a peaceful manner, institutionally and others. So there are 41 chapters in this book, 7 substantive parts, 3 chapters of historical origins, 10 chapters theoretical traditions and their connection to the problem of peaceful change, key material and ideational sources, pivotal state that made contributions, and key regions. Finally, I want to conclude by saying this work on this, Ralf could probably support my contention, encourage us to say that this subject matter deserves a lot more attention in our discipline, just like sociology has change and peace, change as a big part in their approach. And we need to sort of synthesize, bring about what we can think about. The IR paradigms, yes, there is a lot of focus in liberalism and constructivism in particular, but a coherent approach is missing. And the future inquiry should look into structural conditions, likely candidates, relationship between peace and systemic change, domestic, political, and international level change, emerging technologies like cyberspace. Will that cause peaceful change or conflict in the future? Role of social movements. Massive change happened on the Me Too movement or the climate change or the Black Lives Matter. But can we translate that into the international level in any manner? State capacity challenges, the methods and sources and mechanisms and markers, all these require tremendous attention, interdisciplinary approaches. There's considerable literature in other fields. I mean, reading Pinker will give you a lot of ideas from other disciplines about change. And so why peaceful change is followed by violent cycles, as we are in that one of those potential cycle. And this is indeed something that we need to, this big picture IR probably has to come back. And in order to do that, we need a dialogue. Now, different big initial step, but we already have 2-3 major projects in the making. One, we just published a double issue of International Affairs, the Chatham House book journal, 18 chapters on liberal order. and deglobalization of globalization. And I know that Professor Bhupinder is working on another interesting set of papers on East Asia's transformation. Let me stop there, and I really appreciate your doing this as well as contributing to this, hopefully a major beginning for us. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much, TV, and thank you in particular for giving us a sense of the incredible scope of the handbook, and also of the new perspectives that you have opened together, and which are giving rise to new projects. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Ralf Emmers, Dean of RSIS, to share also a few thoughts on his contribution to the handbook. Ralf, please.
Thank you very much, Pascal. Well, today is really a celebration. It's the result of an awful lot of work over the last 2 years. And I think we're all very proud to be part of this project. So a very special thanks, of course, to TV. He's been the dynamo behind this project. He's the one who launched it. He's the one who conceptualized it. And I don't think this book would be published and with us today without his hard work. On top of that, of course, very special thanks to all the other editors, all the contributors, and as TV mentioned, all the RSIS staff members who participated in this project. And clearly this is not the end of it. Understanding peaceful change, I think, is one of the most challenging and timely questions that we all face at the moment, especially in this part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific, where peaceful change at this moment seems under threat. So this is a topic that I think at RSIS and beyond we will continue to study. So the paper that I'm going to co-present with my friend and colleague Meli is a paper that we had a lot of fun working on and presented at various international conferences. So it's the paper that focuses on Southeast Asia. And it looks at the subject through an historical as well as an institutional approach. And it's structured around what we find to be a very interesting puzzle, which is in the 1960s and early 1970s, Southeast Asia was considered to be the Balkans of Asia. It was considered to be a region of immense instability and a war-torn sub-region of Asia. You fast forward 30, 40 years, and it is now considered to be one of the most peaceful regions in the world, at least, and I need to stress this, at least at the interstate level. Things are, of course, different within particular individual Southeast Asian countries. But keeping that caveat in mind, which is an important one, you still see a fundamental shift and transformation. And the paper essentially looks at what explains this transformation over time. And in a nutshell, the argument is that none of the IR theories, or the main ones, realism, liberalism, and constructivism, actually provide a convincing answer to that question. The argument we make in the paper is that the Southeast Asian countries have been eclectic in their approach, even before Katzenstein decided to be eclectic in the study of international relations, by bringing essentially a combination of realist, liberal, and constructivist policies in an interesting mixture that have, we believe, contributed to interstate peace and stability in the region and explain this shift from being war-torn to essentially stable. So the paper is structured along 3 broad sections, and I will very quickly look at 2 of them before passing on the floor to Meli, who will address the question of change and also how the region may continue to evolve in the coming years. So there is an historical perspective, which I think highlights this very gradual process from a zone of war to a zone of peace, but also paying a lot of attention to the role of the great powers and their interference in Southeast Asian affairs. So we very much start from the last case of interstate conflict in Southeast Asia. I'm of course referring to the Cambodian conflict that started in late 1978, but also of course the Indonesian invasion and annexation of East Timor in December 1975 as examples of interstate conflict and war. We then move on to how the Southeast Asian countries dealt with a series of challenges. The power vacuum that came at the end of the Cold War, very much the fear that, in a way, the great powers, and especially the United States, would pull out from the region. A series of transnational security challenges, whether it's terrorism or other forms of non-traditional security, and examining how those transnational forms of insecurity did not generate interstate conflict, as some may have anticipated and assumed. And of course, at this current moment, quite a challenging moment for Southeast Asia, where we are seeing, again, steering power rivalry, especially in the context of the South China Sea issue. Yet, throughout this historical period, we highlight the fact that interstate conflict was or has been avoided, even in the context, for instance, of the South China Sea. So what do the theoretical perspectives tell us? Do they help us to try to understand this situation? And this particular section of the paper argues that none of them by themselves do a very good job explaining this absence of war. Starting, of course, with realism, where, yes, they do pay a lot of attention to the role of the great powers, especially the presence of the United States as a stabilizing power, the hub and spoke model applied to Thailand and the Philippines formally, but also a series of other security arrangements that do exist in the region. But of course, at the same time, no focus given at all to institution building. And we highlight this as a major shortcoming of the Asean, of the realist narrative when applied to Southeast Asia. Likewise, when you look at liberalism, a lot of good information on political economy, the importance of economic growth, sustainability, to try to push those countries to become more economically independent. But again, likewise, a very big part of liberalism, the democratic peace argument, does not really apply to Southeast Asia, because not all the 10 Southeast Asian countries, or shall we say only a few Southeast Asian countries, can truly be defined as liberal democracies. So the fact that none of those countries have actually gone to war cannot be explained through one of the major explanations pushed forward by liberalism. Finally, the constructivists tell us a great deal about identity and the role of institution building, even telling us that we are moving towards being a security community in Southeast Asia, but they pay very little attention to the material factors. So the argument that we make in the paper, and I will pass on the floor to Melly in about 12 seconds, is that none of those theories by themselves are very useful, and essentially it highlights the fact that the Southeast Asian countries have been eclectic. They've been relying on the United States. They've been developing institutions. They've been focusing on economic interdependence concurrently. And I'll stop here and pass on the floor to Melly.
Thank you so much, Ralf. We are, of course, delighted to have with us Professor Melly Caballero-Anthony, who is not only the President's Chair in International Relations and Security Studies, but also the head of our Center for Non-Traditional Security. So, Melly, please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. And let me just say that I'm more than delighted to be part of this wonderful team, and really thanks to TV. And of course, to my colleague Ralf for asking me to join him in writing this paper. It was fun because it helped us to once again reflect on things that we really take for granted. And I emphasize the things for granted because, as TV has, has persuasively argued at the start of this webinar, what do we do, or how do we maintain peaceful change? Or if it is going to actually be threatened, how are countries or states actually dealing with it? So very quickly, as Ralf has mentioned, the challenge of having a more parsimonious explanation to peaceful change in Southeast Asia is really difficult because, as Ralf has mentioned, getting yourself pigeonholed in any one of those three approaches that we are familiar with is unable to provide an adequate and universal explanation to what could explain the peaceful change, particularly after the 1970s in Southeast Asia. And I think what has often been missed in the analysis, at least from those in the traditional IR scholarship, is the role that small and medium powers actually play in trying to maximize whatever resources they have, and then work and apply that kind of agency. So yes, Southeast Asian countries have in the past tried to maintain peaceful relations among themselves. But really, when you look at the three, and if you say which of the three streams actually explain best, and this is where the literature is rich when you look at the role of institutions. And when you talk about the role of institutions as mitigating tensions, and is where you automatically think about the role that ASEAN plays. And when you look at some of the, the assumptions as to why is it that, that as an institution, ASEAN cannot do more to resolve some of the conflicts and the challenges that are faced within the region. And this is where you go to the more constructivist explanation, which looks at how states sort of shape their relationship, interstate conduct based on normative foundations. And this is where the whole notion of the ASEAN way and how that is being played out over the years have helped basically manage that change or maintain the peaceful environment in the region. But our paper goes further than that to say that it's eclectic, but also pushes us to seek for alternative explanations. And this is where I think when TV said, are there other things that we can use beyond the epistemological foundations that we are used to in IR? And this is where I think revisiting the notion of positive peace as an alternative explanation, looking not just at the systems levels analysis, but at the unit level analysis, because one could therefore argue that in light of the rapid changes brought on by globalization and many transnational forces, right, member states in ASEAN have therefore once again reverted back to what is often missed in the explanation of peaceful change. And this is really looking at how they are able to manage and achieve positive peace by, number one, looking at ensuring that economic growth is maintained, and this is more the positive peace is looking at the notion of legitimacy, both national legitimacy and international legitimacy, developing a sense of resilience vis-a-vis external and internal forces. And by moving back by focusing more on this, into these domestic challenges and how they are basically interact with the global. So if one way to depict that is looking at the more intermestic dynamics, the international and the local, then perhaps we're able to then understand or help find ways to understand how these countries that are known to be now the zones of peace are calibrating themselves to respond to major changes, whether it is the increasing belligerence of a more confident China and its interference in regional affairs, the lack of perhaps reliability of the US as a source of security, the rise of technology and all the insecurities that comes about, cyber insecurity and all that. And this new agenda for peace, right, which can be addressed through various means by looking at things like national resilience, back to the notion of promoting positive peace, can actually be seen since the early 2000s, when ASEAN countries decided to enhance more political cooperation, security cooperation, in dealing not just with the traditional, but the non-traditional chains like climate change, natural disasters, food insecurity, pandemics, etc., building up the economic foundations of the states by working towards strengthening regional economic integration. And so you can see a lot of effort being put beyond the ASEAN Economic Community to building a wider trade framework like the RCEP, which, if you actually look at it, I mean, ideally, you're talking about, one-third of global trade coming from RCEP and a contribution of over 500 billion in global trade. So that the potential is there, and this helps in the achievement of the so-called positive peace within states. And third is really ensuring that you're able to build back or reclaim the notion of national resilience. So these variables are very important in explaining, right, how peaceful change could be maintained and could be ushered in light of the existing challenges that that Southeast Asian countries face, and how best to maximize the institution, which is ASEAN, that is there to help member states manage change. So the long and short of the paper is that, okay, yes, we have this change, we have these approaches, they are not able to explain adequately all the things that are going on in the region in light of all these changes. So what are the alternative explanations out there? And we're saying that, yes, there are alternative explanations, highlighting the intermestic relationship with the domestic and the international systems, and see how these are being dealt with at the regional level. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Many thanks to Ralf and to you, Meli, for this provocative challenge to a number of international relation theory, and for this very stimulating effort to come up with alternative perspectives in order to understand peaceful change, particularly, of course, in Southeast Asia. I'm sure that there will be a question and that we can engage in a dialogue on the important issue. I would like now to give the floor to Dr. Rajesh Baskul, who is Senior Fellow in our South Asia program. Rajesh is a good friend, also a contributor to this handbook. And please, Rajesh, I give you the floor now. Take it away. Yes, I think you're on mute.
Yeah,
okay.
No,
just like myself, I need these reminders all the time, despite everything. So please go ahead, Rajesh.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Pascal, and hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I speak also on behalf of my co-author, Kate Sullivan de Strada, probably sound asleep in Oxford right now. We take this opportunity to thank the editors of this path-breaking volume for their Herculean effort in putting it together. In our chapter, Kate and I assess the possibilities of peaceful change with respect to South Asia, which encompasses 8 countries: Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, the Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. We do so by mapping the key sources of interstate tension as well as of cooperation in the region over time. Our criteria for evaluating South Asia's potential for peaceful change encompass the structural dynamics of the region, that is, the distribution of power and its effects, the modifying effect of domestic factors, and the state of the so-called Kantian tripod, that is, democracy, economic interdependence, and regional institutions in the region. We divide the period from the 1940s onwards into 2. The post-colonial period, which coincided with the Cold War, and thereafter the post-Cold War era, which has seen greater integration of the region with the global economy and significant, though not uniform, changes in its political dynamics. Let me begin with the region's structure. As is obvious, South Asia is geographically Indo-centric. India is a preponderant state in the region, also with about 80% of South Asia's GDP, and consequently is also a preeminent military power. Though nuclear-armed Pakistan does, of course, undercut this substantially. The overall effect of India's hegemony during the first period under consideration was that its neighbors tended to lean on the bigger non-regional states, that is the US and China, to try and balance India. On its part, India tended to assert its power and intervene militarily in the region from time to time. For instance, in Pakistan in 1971, and which contributed to the birth of Bangladesh, and in Sri Lanka in 1987, when India sent in a peacekeeping force to try and end that nation's civil war against its wishes. Only two other states, Afghanistan and Pakistan, have a common land border, and here too structure has shaped frequently uneasy relations since Pakistan is by far more powerful and dominant. Since the end of the Cold War, this constant tension between India and most of its neighbors has somewhat reduced. Though interaction with Pakistan remains antagonistic, relations with several others have displayed greater strategic and economic cooperation, though not always consistently. We note that structure is modified by domestic factors in two important ways in this case. First, much of the variation in India's relationships can be explained by shifts in the domestic politics of its neighbors. Changes in party control and leadership have led to peaks and troughs in the relationship, notably vis-a-vis Afghanistan, the Maldives, and Sri Lanka. Second, and quite remarkably, despite its rising military power, India has actually been less inclined to intervene militarily in its neighbors' affairs than before, even when they have encouraged China's growing presence in the region to Indian discomfort. So in the structural or systemic sense, there has been some positive change, though its future direction, I think, depends on the domestic politics of the states of the region, as well as India's continuing strategic restraint. Let me now turn to the role of democracy. Liberals have come out with what seems to be a reasonable argument that there is such a thing called the democratic peace, which is to say that democracies do not go to war with one another. From this perspective, South Asia's prospects for peaceful change do not actually look very good. Democracy has periodically wobbled and stumbled in the face of authoritarian pressure and has been at best weak, with formal structures and processes often undercut by shortcomings with respect to basics such as tolerance, fundamental rights, and due process of law. Afghanistan, as we all know, has recently reversed course. Pakistan remains a hybrid state dominated by the military, and India today is scarcely an exemplar with respect to freedom of dissent and minority rights. As long as there is a democratic deficit, we cannot really anticipate a significant movement towards a democratic peace. What of the prospects for peaceful change driven by economic cooperation and growing interdependence? Here the picture is a mixed one. In the post-colonial decades, economic interaction among South Asia's states was marginal, except in the case of India's trade with Bhutan and Nepal, both landlocked nations needing access to the world through India. That picture has changed, but only in a limited way. There are certainly glimmerings of change. Sri Lanka has a free trade pact with India and numerous investments, including most recently a $700 million port deal with India's Adani Group signed in September. Bangladesh has also welcomed Indian investments, something it had previously shied away from. But all of South Asia's states, including India, still depend on extra-regional connections for trade and investment to a substantial extent with China. So overall economic interdependence as a source of peaceful change is, in our opinion, at best a distant beacon. Finally, a word about institutions. This too is not an encouraging facet of the political life of the region. With nearly 4 decades behind it, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, or SARC, has, depending on one's degree of optimism, been somewhere between comatose and stagnant. Hampered by the constant tensions between India and Pakistan and constrained by the lack of significant intra-regional trade and investment, SAARC has struggled actually to stay relevant. India, for that matter, has turned its attention to sub-regional and trans-regional cooperation through such institutions as BIMSTEC and projects for enhancing connectivity between India and Southeast Asia. The pandemic did energize SAARC a little as India initiated a vaccine friendship program to supply cheap vaccines to its neighbors. But that received a setback when India itself was hit hard by COVID-19 infections and had to focus on its own needs. The vaccine friendship program is being revived, but SAARC as a source of peaceful change has miles to go. In sum, the overall picture today is at best a mixed one and seems unlikely to produce peaceful change in the near future. Let me close by asking, what would be required for things to move in a more positive direction? 3 factors can be identified. 1, a warming of India-Pakistan relations. Now, this long-standing rivalry appears intractable, but so did the Cold War just a few years before it fizzled out. We have seen the tantalizing possibility of a dramatic turnaround in the mid-2000s when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and President Pervez Musharraf came close to a breakthrough agreement before the latter's domestic troubles threw a spanner in the works. But we cannot discard the possibility as unrealistic. 2, the rapid recovery and accelerated growth of the Indian economy would give intra-regional trade and investment a boost, making regional relationships warmer. This appears unlikely today as India's economic performance has been lackluster for a decade, but numerous projections are positive and the trajectory seems to be moving upwards. For instance, the World Economic League anticipates that India's economy will climb from 6th to 3rd place in world rankings by 2030, and several other public and private institutions have given similar assessments. 3rd, rapid democratization of the region could bring change. But to us, this is the least likely prospect. Given the worldwide struggle of societies to cope with the effects of globalization and the backlash that this has produced, democracy everywhere is being subjected to illiberal pressures, and South Asia is no exception. But 2 out of 3 isn't so bad. So while we should not expect too much, there does appear to be a glimmer of light at the distant end of a long tunnel. Thank you.
Many thanks, Rajesh, also for this final optimism at the end. We were expecting it. Oh my God, where is it going? Is it still peaceful change? Is it still change? But I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to go back to these great points. It was wonderful. Also, by the way, I really enjoyed in a way the inter-regional comparative perspective with Meli and Ralf highlighting a number of dynamics on Southeast Asia and yourself highlighting a number of key trends in South Asia. And I think that was certainly part of the strength of this handbook. Last but certainly not least, I'd like now to give the floor to Associate Professor Bhupinder Singh, who is our head of graduate studies at RSIS. Please, Bhupinder, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Pascal. Can you guys all hear me?
Yes, we can. Okay. We can hear you. We can see you fine. I think we're all good.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, firstly, I would like to thank the editors for the very kind invitation to actually contribute. And I think that TV in fact deserves, I think, special thanks here, especially for his extremely strong leadership and vision that has in fact led to this entire project to be so successful, right? This has not only led to this handbook, but there has been like a series of in fact special issues that have been in fact published. He has also formed like a network And thank you, TV, for your, for your leadership, and also partnering with, RSIS. And so what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to start my presentation, but I'm going to use slides. I'm going to share my screen now. And Pascal, if you can let me know if you can see this.
Yes, I'm pleased to share with you that we can see your slide right
Okay.
now. I think we're all, it's amazing.
Okay.
When technology works, I cannot believe it myself, but it does. Okay.
Okay, great news. Okay, so I'm going to examine the concept of peaceful change in the context of Northeast Asia. If Northeast Asia, as you all know, has been it has been in fact, like a hard case to study peaceful change, right? This entire region is usually characterized by war and conflict, right? It is seen to be, in fact, extremely volatile, and there is no shortage of publications that do in fact prove this point, right? So I would like to argue that that in fact, despite the high level of uncertainty, and of course the presence of numerous regional challenges, I think Northeast Asia has in fact achieved a stable, minimal peace since the region's peaceful transition from the Cold War to the post-Cold War period. Right. In fact, the post-Cold War period has been a very, very unique, period in the region's history. This is the first peaceful, ordered transition for Northeast Asia since, in fact, the Sino-centric period, right? So what I mean by the term minimal, this actually conforms to the definition that is used in the book. It is actually defined as international change and transformation without the use of military force and war. And I think that even Northeast Asia does in fact conform to this definition, right? So what I intend to do, or what I did, and then what I did in this chapter was to investigate the main sources of minimal peace, and I in fact also and I also assess them, especially in the light of worsening US China competition, especially from the 2010 period. And so in this chapter, I identified three realist and liberal factors, and they are in fact American hegemony, economic interdependence, and of course institutionalism, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to in fact assess each of these factors in the two periods. In fact, the first phase, which is from the onset of the post-Cold War period all the way until 2009, and then I'm going to assess the same three the same three factors from the 2010 period, right? So in the first phase of I want to argue that in fact the minimal peace was in fact sustained by the three main factors, which are of course the American hegemony, or in fact the American unipolarity, right? Which actually ensured a stable balance of power, and it also countered the range of regional challenges that in fact the region faced. Then of course you have economic interdependence, which was extremely important. Here, in fact, all the states in Northeast Asia, right? Even most of them. So my focus was on China, Japan, and South Korea. They all pursued the policies that in fact promoted development and prosperity. And this was an important source to actually build intra and inter-regional cooperation. And this in fact led to in fact very strong interdependence that in fact I would argue mitigated the escalation of bilateral tensions and also in fact raised the cost of conflicts for these certain states. And then I come to institutionalism. In fact, the entire Northeast Asian region, again, in fact, especially, I think, especially Japan, South Korea, and China, they have been, in fact, proactive participants in the formal and informal multilateral arrangements, right? In fact, the Asian financial crisis was an extremely important, I think, booster. I think for Northeast Asia's strengthened participation in the entire regional in the entire regional multilateralism process, right? In fact, as a result of the Asian financial crisis, if Northeast Asia, if it became integrated into the East Asian multilateral process, right? And it also, in fact, led to the growth of the Northeast Asia's own regionalism as well, especially in the form of Northeast Asian Trilateral Summit, right? This, of course, actually, led to the dialogue. This, of course, led to the cooperation, and also, I think, in fact, some level of, integration, right? So I think minimal peace was, in fact, ensured here. And so the question is, in fact, whether, in fact, the minimal peace, the hard-earned minimal peace is sustainable, especially in the post-2010 period, especially with the worsening of the US-China competition, right? And so, I would argue that it is still, I think, durable. I think minimal peace is still, I think, durable, especially in the coming decades. And I think the three factors still do play a part or role in terms of ensuring this, I think, minimal peace, right? So if you would start with I think interdependence, economic interdependence, especially. In fact, if you look at what I think all the three countries, as I said before, like Japan, PRC, and also like ROK, they have actually expanded on their policies to promote the cooperation. They are strong supporters of free trade and also globalization, right? Like China actually has in fact promoted robust policies to actually in fact promote the cooperation. And in fact, if you were to look at Northeast Asia itself, in fact, these three countries have, in fact, they have also launched, in fact, the process of signing the FTA amongst, in fact, the three countries. So, in fact, the process is still in a very, very early stage, right? But they have started discussions on a possible FTA, right? Even though they haven't signed the FTA yet, they have signed an important investment treaty, right? In fact, the ROK and PRC have signed an FTA, and all the three countries have they are part of, in fact, the regional FTA, of course, called it in the form of the RCEP. In terms of institutionalism, I think Northeast Asia has further, in fact, integrated into the East Asian multilateral process, and they are not just, in fact, active in the area of economics and politics, but also now in the domain of security as well, right? There have been a growth of informal and formal multilateral arrangements outside of the ASEAN-led, in fact, order, So you have, for example, like informal trilaterals. You have, for example, the Quad. You have, in fact, the like China-led, you have the China-led, institutions, and you have also, in fact, the resumption of the Northeast Asian trilateral summit, like annual summits. What has if a question that has that is always raised is in fact on the factor of a US hegemony, right? In fact, with the rise of China, right? In fact, the US is always perceived to be in fact in a like a relative like decline. While that may be true, in fact, if you were to look at the like analysis out there, I think if America is still in fact the strongest, I think, military power in terms of the capability, capacity, and battle experience, it still in fact maintains a robust alliance network, right? And it has also been proactive in countering Chinese leadership in the region. Even if in fact the US has in fact suffered like a relative, I think, decline, right? Its own like allies and partners have actually stepped up in just some ways in terms of helping to like sustain the US, I think, presence and also order and also leadership, especially seen in the examples of, I think, FOIP and also CPTPP, right? So I think in fact the US, I think, continues to play an important role in actually like ensuring a like a stable balance of, I think, power, right? In fact, at the same time, I think there are also, I think, problems in terms of, I think, Chinese attempts to build its own, I think, order. There are still, I think, there are strong suspicions, in fact, amongst the regional states, I think, towards, I think, Chinese initiatives, right? Especially worsen, I think, in fact, due to Chinese, assertiveness expressed in its hardline foreign policy. So, and so in, I think, conclusion, so what I would just in fact say is that peace and peaceful change, and that could be applied to Northeast Asia, even though it is I think perceived as like a hard case. It is extremely important to, I think, highlight the sources of peace that have maintained a minimal peace in the region. In fact, the peace is extremely fragile. In fact, it is important that all the great powers, major powers in the region invest, in fact, in these, I think, the areas. Yeah, because, the alternative is actually conflict, right? So I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bhupinder, for your very rich presentation, and thank you to all our panelists for giving us a sense of the incredible richness of the handbook and of its values, both theoretically and empirically. So what I'd like to do now is, of course, open the floor for question and share with all our participants that you're welcome to use the Q&A chat. What you have to do is very simple. You type your question in there. We will see it. I will see it myself, and I will be very pleased to relay that question to our participants. So please feel free to use that chat. Go ahead, ask any question you may have. And of course, I will abuse my privilege as the chair of this session and suggest to our panelists just two broad questions. And you can really, it's à la carte. It's à la carte. So you pick and choose. You don't have to answer all of them. But I'm curious about two things, okay? So the first thing is that TV suggested and I'm sure enforced to all of you to work with, to wrestle, to use the notion of peaceful change, right? He wanted you to explore that notion and gave you incentives to play with it, right? With the different regions that you are interested in, okay? So my question is, as you did that, right, as you used the notion of peaceful change to examine a series of regional and international issues, did you discover things, or does that process lead you to highlight actors or dynamics that you were not expecting, that in a sense came out a bit as a surprise for you, right? Because all of you have been studying these regions previously, but perhaps not through the lenses of this problematic of peaceful change. And I was wondering if by doing so, there are things that you looked at a bit differently. So that would be my first question, if any, and if you could give us one example, that would be fantastic. And I have a second question, which of course is related to the current news. We are in the middle of the COP26 in Glasgow, or all sorts of debate about environmental change, environmental protection. And I was wondering if you could share any thoughts on whether you see the environmental challenge that we're facing as a whole as a hindrance to a peaceful change, or in a sense as a component of what this peaceful change would be all about, right? Is there something that here about large, and as Melly said earlier, very transnational set of questions related to the environment that would foster, that would create and facilitate or reinforce a dynamic of peaceful change? Or is it the case that this issue is actually so hard, so complex, right, that it's not going to do that? And I'm curious about any thoughts you may have on this. And who would like to start? And I would like to ask our audience again, please use the Q&A chat to ask any question you may have. So please, anybody would like to start addressing those questions. As I said, it's à la carte. So.
I will just give some general discoveries that led me when I was looking at the overall picture, is this focus on the Kantian tripod, and discovering that, at least in some chapters, a clear discussion on it. All the three elements can sometimes lead to non-peaceful, violent, or conflictual outcomes. An example, international institutions. The chapter by Vincent Folio and Frederick Mera talk about the negative effects of institutions. They freeze status quo. They sometimes prevent change because they have the standard operating procedures, there's politics in it. There are quite a few reasons why institutions don't always lead to peace or peaceful change. Same with economic interdependence, that can be used by actors for coercive purposes and not so peaceful outcome. And there's a big literature on that, interdependence and war and conflict. But beyond the literature, it is the strategy of use of interdependence. Democracy, as Rajesh mentioned, the democratic deficit, it's actually through peaceful means by which non-democratic forces get into power, especially the populists. And then they tilt the whole process in their interests. And all this shows that these things that we take for granted in IR, the liberal IR is very much into this tripod, without really realizing under what these democracy or can cause not so peaceful outcomes. I think that was one discovery that I think I have quite a few, but this was definitely something that I would pursue if someone is engaged in this.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much, TV. Any other takers on any of these questions, please? Yes, please, Melly, go ahead.
Okay, can I have a stab on the questions that you've asked? Are there any actors that have, in a way, challenged change, right, or threatened, or how do you say? How did you phrase it? But anyway, has impacted on peaceful change. And this is where, this so-called changed global environment, from the way we have sort of traditionally looked at them, is really playing catch up, because the whole how do you say approaches was to maintaining peace and security is based on, you know, state action, right? So when you have power, for example, how that power is being used, hegemonic or etc., and then the need for institutions to mitigate such state behavior, and then you have, of course, the more social logical explanation of how developed sense of community, sense of identity, etc., can sort of again part of this mitigating thingy. But we forgot now that there are actually triggers or drivers of conflict that are not, you know, that are a result of state behavior, state action. And this is where when you talk about, you know, the impact of the environment on climate change, etc. And this climatic, we call it anthropogenic risk actually, or the Anthropocene risk, the Anthropocene has already changed substantially our notion of security, and this is an uncomfortable thing that you know, the conventional IR scholarship would want to deal, because this is so-called, like, you know, these are soft security issues. They don't really lend to some of our lenses, but it's very hard when you look at the impact of climate change and its threat to territories, threat to massive displacement, for example, existential threat as it is has been designed, and you know, threats like the pandemic. I mean, it's very hard to say that these are just low politics. The distinction between what's high and low politics is really now increasingly blurred. And so what does that, how does that actually then, what's the implication of that on the way we look at things and and the methods and then the mechanisms that are there to manage peaceful change, right? And this is where, again, all, you know, institutions matter, you know, and and institutions at the same time, when we think about, you know, institutions as part of regime building, trying to shape behavior of states, trying to order state relationship, they can also lead to conflicts, because there is inherently competition in there, right? But these are at the level, but on the national level, right? You have to remember, at least in the context of the region, Southeast Asia and the wider region, right? It's really now the combination of both endogenous and external drivers of conflict. And when you talk about internal drivers of conflict, and this is where democratization is, the whole thing about democratic peace also impinges on the region, because don't forget, in Southeast Asia, we are dealing with a very major challenge of, you know, what's happening in Myanmar in terms of this push. Go back to at least that what status quo they had before the military coup. And this is where, you know, the whole thing about does democratization actually lead to peaceful change? And yeah, it's go back to, you know, this whole democratic peace theory may not necessarily be true for other regions. And it is important when we analyze, right, drivers for change, peaceful change, to look at context-specific conditions, right? And where we then say, right, we have these big debates out there, big approaches out there, but how does that actually relate or explain the context of peaceful change in the region, right? And this is where in our paper, and then in which we have in fact then expanded further, which we contribute to Boob's special issue, is to say, okay, what else is there? You know, have there been explanations in the past that sort of help us understand how peaceful change has been ushered in the region, has been maintained, and increasingly being challenged, right? That we need to revisit. Right, this whole notion of being able to build national capacity. People like scholars like Mataya Alagapa has been saying, you know, yes, there will always be this minimalist peace in the region. It will not be threatened because, you know, the psychology of state is that they always look inwards first, developing state capacity, including, of course, nuclear deterrence if other countries that have the capacity to do so, but making sure that the economic growth is not threatened, because that leads to conflict, and conflict, therefore, societal conflict can be, you know, can be used potentially as, you know, as possible openings for external interference, right? At the same time, building on existing institutions, looking at its weaknesses and strengthening them. And this is where economic interdependence has always been one of the pathways to peace in the region, and it explains, you know, the interaction between Southeast Asia with Northeast Asia, etc. So that's my take on it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mehdi. In fact, I have two questions from our participants which really follow up on these debates. So let me continue to open this dialogue with these two questions. So the first is really about the connection between peaceful change and multilateralism, the significance of international institutions in general. And we have one of our participants who is saying, you know, generally speaking, peaceful change has been closely associated with periods, with dynamics in which multilateralism matters, in which international institutions really work well. But this participant is saying today, in today's world, multilateralism and institutions seem to be in crisis, right? Seem to be in some cases in decline and in real crisis. So if that is the case, is there any real prospect for peaceful change, right? Peaceful change in a period of crumbling and crisis of multilateralism and institutions. So that would be the first question. And any thought about that? Do you think there is this connection is strong, and what would you think about that? And related to that, on a more on a focus on Southeast Asia, what could ASEAN do to show its relevance for peaceful change? That is to say, if we look at this problem of institution in Southeast Asia, is there something that ASEAN should be doing, or perhaps has been doing, to show its contribution to peaceful change in the region? So I leave that open. Any of our panelists would like to jump in and share some thoughts. Ralf, maybe we can start with you.
On institutions and peaceful change, I think what was fascinating comparing the three sub-regions of Asia is to differentiate between Southeast Asia, where you have a very clear sense of regionalism and institution building. And I would argue, it's my inclination to argue this point, that it has led and contributed to peaceful change. And then to compare it to two sub-regions where multilateralism is either non-existent or incredibly weak. And here I'm referring, of course, to East Asia and South Asia. But I think it goes beyond the building of institutions. What it really requires is reconciliation. And that has been the success story of Southeast Asia, which you don't have in South Asia and in East Asia. The process of reconciliation started and predated or came together with the formation of ASEAN. Of course, the geopolitical circumstances were much more complex, but what is missing to build institutions in South Asia and in East Asia is a real process of reconciliation between India and Pakistan and China and Japan. And until this happens, I don't think we'll have real institutions that can promote peaceful change. So institutions, to me, are a facilitator, but they need to have a prerequisite, and that prerequisite needs to be regional reconciliation. And I think that is basically what we are missing. And I know that ASEAN is going through a rough patch, but we should remember that ASEAN has always gone through a rough patch. It's never really been easy for the association, and somehow it still manages to kind of like get through. And of course, it is a very challenging period, but as long as you have that lowest common denominator of understanding of standard norms of behavior among the ASEAN countries, I think they will continue to play a part in having that peaceful change process. So that's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Could I ask Rajesh and Bhupinder to follow up on some of these aspects, since we highlighted the comparative regionalism in some ways? Who would like to go first? Rajesh, you would? Yeah, please.
Thank you. I think I would put it more generally that the prospects for peaceful change in most significant areas have to be understood in terms of the relationship between ideational and material factors. I don't think in this world of ours that ideationally driven change takes place by itself, so to speak, without having a foundation based in material factors. So take a look at the climate change negotiations now going on. I mean, sure, there are lots of criticisms and so on, but climate change discussions have been going on for decades. It's not new. Okay, but for a long time, there was no kind of impetus, no kind of energy developed in those relations. It is only as climatic conditions themselves have become kind of worsened visibly to everyone over the last few years that there has been a kind of increased or accelerated interest in trying to do something about it. So I'm not saying that it is easy. It is still difficult. There are still lots of problems. But the fact is that, you have to understand ideational change is taking place. And this ideational change is taking place because of the recognition of the reality, which is that environmental interdependence is becoming more intense and coming home to us in ways that we feel the pain, So it's like, how did the Cold War end? A big thing like that happened, not just because Gorbachev, was a man with new ideas which he wanted to push, but it was also based on the hard reality that the Soviet Union was in many ways losing the race. Okay, now that in itself was not enough because predecessors like Brezhnev or Chernenko or Andropov didn't do anything about it, but Gorbachev did. And so it is built, this ideational thrust is built on some material foundation. And I think there's a constant tension between the two, and that is what is happening, what is happening today with regard to the climate change negotiations.
Great, thank you so much, Rajesh. Bubinda, would you like to add briefly, because I have more questions. It's not because I'm not interested in what you have to say.
Sure.
I'm anticipating, please.
If I may just respond to your question about surprises. I think one of the surprise that I had was actually how little work there is on Northeast Asia and peace, or even stability, actually. And I guess there is no surprise, I think, because of this entire cast of like actors that are in Northeast Asia, right? And then with their history and so on and so forth, right? And in fact, there were like a few, I think, works out there, and they had used mainly liberal and social constructivist factors to actually explain stability or the peace. And I was surprised at how how little emphasis there was for like realist factors to explain stability, right? And so here I am trying to contribute to this, I think, field with this, I think, chapter, right? In terms of the question about the multilateralism, I think that's a good question. I think for East Asia and also Northeast Asia, I think in fact states have, I think, responded to the weaknesses of, I think, big N or large N, I think, multilaterals, right? As you see, in fact, in the region, you have a lot more unilaterals now, right? And they can be formal, informal, right? But I think doesn't actually mean that in fact states have moved away from the large, and they have moved away from the large and multilaterals, right? As I think we all know, in the East Asia, there is a very strong belief in the complex, patchwork of the entire multilateral order. In fact, a term or a phrase that has been used by I think Victor Cha, right? So even though in fact the large end multilaterals are not perhaps doing what they're supposed to do, right? East Asian states, including Northeast Asian states, have in fact responded in a lot of ways, especially through the unilaterals, but they continue to show strong support to the large end multilaterals here, right? So I'll stop here because I think you have more questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bubinda. So let me share two more questions from our audience. So the first question is really the sort of big picture question, right? And it is, after you've studied these dynamics of peaceful change in the different regions, etc., if you take a step back and ask yourself, what is the greatest challenge to achieve peaceful change in the end? What would that be? Okay, what would that be? So that's first question. And I assume that our participant would like to know in the specific region that you studied, but if you have an idea about, the general problem, then feel free to share with us. So that's one question. The second question is really about the connection between peaceful change and democracy, right? And particularly not just democracy in general or democracy as an ideal, but really about democratic practices, right? The sort of day-to-day practice of democracy, okay? And the question is, do you think that peaceful change could occur without democratic practices? Do you think these two things are possible? Here are my questions. So please, the floor is yours. Who would be a taker for these two great questions? Or one of them, as I said, it's still à la carte. It's still à la carte. So please, who like the TV?
Let me at least try to answer the second question, but I have a little bit of a suggestion on this multilateralism issue, which I think it's an interesting question too. I think the biggest challenge historically too is sort of misreading intentions and capabilities. Countries jumping the gun thinking they have control over events. World War I situation. I'm now talking about at the micro level, decision-making level. Leaders can really think in their cocoons, okay, we can control events, we can somehow control the escalatory process. I think if you talk about that, then the capabilities will be very important. And that is changing dramatically with the introduction of AI, with the introduction of cyber, etc. Will this lead to a desire on the part of elite to kind of expedite the process of power transition, as we witnessed in the previous centuries? If so, that will be a major challenge to peaceful change of any order, because once you get into intense rivalry and conflict, things sometimes go out of control. On the issue of this multilateralism, I must say there are certain critical junctures when the impetus for multilateralism happens. That's usually the end of a great war or end of a Cold War type of thing. But no institutions, no multilateral process stays for long. There's always cycles. But there is some silver bullets here. That is, we know, studying Robert Dahl, the notion of cross-cutting cleavages, the idea of cross-cutting memberships, because I think there's a dense connectivities here, whether it is at the global level, G20 to BRICS, or at the same time, we have trade agreement, RCEP, etc. So I don't see the minilaterals as challenging that order. It is better that countries engage. In fact, what is missing in the US, China is the lack of engagement. It was a pleasure to see them at least talking about climate change just yesterday. They need to talk. Doesn't mean that that's going to resolve all that, but at least to avoid this great problem of miscommunications. I will leave the democracy question to my other colleagues.
Right, thank you so much, TV. Any other attempt to address it? Yes, please, Ralf, go ahead.
Maybe quickly on democracy in Southeast Asia, which is not really a field that I have studied, but I will problematize the question a bit by saying maybe it depends on your level of analysis. If you're looking at interstate relations in Southeast Asia, you could argue that this constitutes a challenge to the liberal peace theory, that peace has indeed, at the interstate level, been consistent in spite of the absence of 10 liberal democracies coexisting in Southeast Asia. And that's an interesting puzzle. That seems to suggest that you can have interstate peace without democracy. However, if you do include the domestic, you of course reach a very, very different conclusion, because then you could argue that in fact Southeast Asia is not as peaceful as IR theory makes us believe, because there are a series of domestic conflicts and of course insurgencies and other movements, and the Myanmar situation comes to mind, where you could argue that the absence of a democracy broadly defined is at the core of some of those issues. So maybe the question needs to specify at what level you are hoping to achieve peaceful change.
Thank you very much, Ralf. We are slowly coming to an end, unfortunately, of our seminar, but I would like to give a chance to Meli, to Rajesh, and to Bubinda, perhaps to touch upon some of the aspects of these questions before we conclude. Meli, would you like to address some of the points that were raised?
Yeah. Well, let me start with the last question on democracy. And yes, the experience in Southeast Asia, at least as far as peaceful change is concerned, was not contingent on the democratization of countries in the region. Yeah, I mean, that's a fact. You have in Southeast Asia, for example, and even in Northeast Asia, right? We have all this, these institutions and all of these frameworks that we have that comprise many illiberal states, so to speak, but it hasn't stopped them from moving forward in agreeing towards doing cooperative ventures that helps, capacities of states, help economic development, etc. But at the same time, the kind of dramatic transformation, perhaps, that what we're looking for will be limited, right? Will be constrained because of the lack of similarities of democratization. And you see that within the context of ASEAN. That's perhaps one reason why, the conflict, a regional and domestic conflict, which has now become a regional and global conflict, like in the case of Myanmar, is not able to move as fast as can be resolved, because there are countries in the region that are also illiberal and that to being proactive in resolution, in helping the resolution of the conflict in a way, it sort of bounces back at them. So they're not able to do so. And there's certain norms that is supposed to promote greater regional cohesion, and in a way we're advancing perhaps a more quality type peace. I don't know whether there's such a thing, higher quality peace rather than a minimalist peace, where there is no outbreaks of conflict. And the higher type of peace that we're looking for is perhaps what we call about the security community type, right? Then, of course, the lack of democratization becomes a hindrance. And this is where I go back. I'd like to sort of latch on to the whole notion of our understanding of multilateral institutions when TV talked about we misread intentions and we misread capabilities. To me, I agree with that, but I also look at the latter part, the misreading capabilities. We always assume, particularly in the context of understanding institutions in the region, that once you have an institution, the capacity is there, right? And actually, no. Right, and the capacity, the lack of capacity, whether it is material capacity or the lack of ideological coherence, is basically because also that the intentions of joining institutions may be is largely instrumental than how we actually read. The intentions of joining institutions is there. So this is where I think some of the realist thinking on the limits of institutions perhaps also applies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meli. I'd like to give the floor for one word to Rajesh and to Bubinda on whichever aspect of these questions you're interested in. Rajesh, would you like to share just a short comment, please?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
I think there are three major challenges to peaceful change today. By that I mean major in the sense that those are which relate to human survival. One is the pandemic, second is nuclear weapons, and the third is climate change. Now, the pandemic is going badly, has gone badly, but we have found ways to try and deal with it. Okay, and things are moving forward. Nuclear weapons, we have found ways also, I think, to exercise caution and try to avoid nuclear war, which is the case for 75 years. And finally, climate change seems to be the most difficult, I think. And I feel it's the one which is going to be hard to reverse once you cross a certain line. So yes, I think it's fair to say climate change is the big one today.
Great. Thank you so much, Rajesh. Bhupinder, a word of conclusion on any aspect of these questions.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much for that. So in terms of the peaceful change and democracy for I think Northeast Asia, in fact, in my conclusion is that this factor wasn't so important in terms of explaining minimal peace in Northeast Asia, right? And then in fact you have the cases where I think in fact PRC, even though it is not a democratic state, has also I think contributed in fact in its own ways to the peaceful state in the region. And you also have two countries that are strong democracies like Japan and South Korea. They in fact continue to have their own problems, right? And so what I think would be the greatest challenge for Northeast Asia in terms of peaceful change for now, I think, is a lack of historical conciliation, right? I think that is what is holding these countries back from actually furthering a greater integration of the entire region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bhupinder. Ladies and gentlemen, our book launch webinar is coming to an end. I hope you will agree with me that our panelists did a great job to show you the diversity and the stimulating insights of this Oxford Handbook of Peaceful Change and International Relations. You must buy this book. You must buy it now. And soon there will be a QR code with a wonderful sort of discount. Don't miss out, because if you miss this discount, it's a catastrophe. You will pay more. So please buy. And it's just buying a book. You're buying an encyclopedia. It's something that will stay there. You can refer to it back. And so please do that. I want to take this opportunity. So once again, to thank our panelists very much for their contributions today. And I would like also to thank very much the event unit of RSIS, particularly Rachel and Farik, for their help to set up the whole thing and help us with the organization. Once again, thank you so much. We'll have other events for you very soon, and I wish you a very good Friday, the rest of the day. And once again, use the QR code and buy the book. Thank you all very much. All right.
Thank you very much. That was